Hello everyone, my name is Hope and welcome to this video where I will be doing a soft-spoken ranking of Jane Austen's works from my least favorite to my very favorite. Now let me start by saying that even my least favorite Jane Austen book I would rather reread than a lot of my favorite books by other authors. That's how much I enjoy Jane Austen's work. So just because some of these are my least favorite doesn't mean that I didn't still enjoy them. So if your favorites are at the bottom of the list, I'm not saying I disliked them or didn't enjoy them. They just weren't my very favorite. Anyway, with that being said, my least favorite Jane Austen work is Sanditon, the Watsons, and Lady Susan. All three of them are in the same book here. Sanditon and the Watsons were both unfinished works, so I think it's appropriate that they're at the bottom of the list because you can't really compare an unfinished work to an entire completed novel. And then Lady Susan is the only work by Jane Austen that's done in an epistolary format where we're reading the story in letters being sent by people. All three of these were published after Jane Austen died. Lady Susan was published in 1871, and my copy is 74 pages long. Sanditon was published in 1925 and is 65 pages long, and The Watsons was published in 1871 and is 50 pages long. I found it interesting to read the two unfinished works and kind of imagine where that book would have ended up if she had been able to finish writing it. With the Watsons, when she was writing it, she was planning on having the main character's father die, and then her father died in real life, and then she completely lost interest in finishing the book, understandably so. And then she was working on Sanditon the year that she died and was unfortunately in too poor of health to finish it. Lady Susan is very fun to read, but due to how short it is and how the character Lady Susan is so unlikable, and also the format being epistolary, which isn't always my favorite, I put this at the bottom with the two unfinished works. It is still a fun read though. Lady Susan, I believe, is the oldest main character to ever be in any of Jane Austen's works. She has already been married once, and I believe her first husband died, and she has a daughter who is about 16, I believe. And you're reading these letters that she is writing to various people, which just show how self centered and obnoxious she is, but it's also very funny. Anyway, that's at my very bottom. Then, after that, I have Northanger Abbey. Northanger Abbey, even though it was one of Jane Austen's first works, it wasn't published until after she died. Northanger Abbey was published in 1817. It's 265 pages long. The protagonist of this book, her name is Catherine Morland, and the trope, I guess, for the romance line, I'm not going to tell you the names of any of the male love interests so that I don't spoil that for anyone who hasn't read these, but I will be saying kind of the romance trope or type of romance storyline that's used in each book. For this, I would say it could be categorized as forbidden love just because the father of the guy the protagonist likes is very disapproving of Catherine. Anyway, even though this is one of my least favorite Jane Austen books, it does have my favorite quote from any of Jane Austen's books ever. It reads like this: "The person, be it a gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid." That is my favorite quote from any Jane Austen book. Anyway, so Catherine is just very naive, has essentially no experience in the real world, is going out and meeting people and trying to find a husband, and is taken advantage of by so many people, and just has absolutely no idea how to handle herself. And I just don't enjoy stories very much where the protagonist is so naive and so just lost in society. And also, the plot has essentially no plot twists at all, not really any complexity to it. It's just essentially a really naive girl who starts having a crush on this guy she meets, and then the dad, whenever he finds out that the two of them are kind of getting involved with each other, is very disapproving and tries to shut it down because she doesn't have very much money and he doesn't approve of his son getting involved with someone who's poor. And anyway, it's still very enjoyable though to read. And I think I would have appreciated this book so much more if I had realized that this book is trying to make fun of the Gothic genre and Gothic novels. But at the time, I thought that the character was just that stupid, I guess, instead of Jane Austen making fun of the Gothic genre. So if you go into it knowing that's a satire about the Gothic genre, then I think it will be way more enjoyable. I think if I reread this knowing what I know now, I would enjoy it way more. And it really does have a lot of humor in it. It really does have a whole lot of humor in it. It's definitely one of Jane Austen's funnier books for sure. So that is Northanger Abbey. Next up in line, I have Persuasion. Persuasion was also published after Jane Austen's death. It was published in 1817 and is 202 pages long. The main protagonist is Anne Elliot, and this can be classified as a second chance romance. I will say that Anne Elliot is definitely one of my favorite protagonists out of the protagonists in the Jane Austen books. She is very quiet but very intelligent, and she got persuaded out of marrying someone who she loved by family earlier on in life. And now she is older even though she's still in her 20s, she's old enough that society considers her a spinster and past marrying age, and she may or may not run into the person she was persuaded out of marrying years previously. And it's a story to see, are they going to get together this time? And I think that out of all of Jane Austen's books, that this is the very sweetest romance out of all of them. I think it's the cutest and the sweetest and the most heartwarming. So if you aren't a huge fan of kind of enemies to lovers, constantly people bickering and bantering with each other, and you just want a more sweet romance, I would definitely recommend this. It's also one of her shortest works, and it's just a very sweet and short romance story, and I definitely enjoyed Anne as the protagonist a lot. It just is not super complex since it's so short, but sometimes all you want is something just super sweet, short, and not complicated. So that is Persuasion. Then next up, I have Sense and Sensibility. This was really, I believe, Jane Austen's first book that was successfully published while she was still alive. And it was published in 1811. It is 295 pages long, and the main protagonists are Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. And this story is a little bit more unique because it shows I couldn't really think of a romance trope to pair with this book, but really it demonstrates two different approaches to love. One of the sisters is way more quiet, reserved, cautious. The other one is more bold, loud, and a risk taker. Both of them are of marrying age, and they're trying to find a husband, and you just follow them along as they both take kind of opposite approaches to finding a man, and you see where that leads them and who they end up with. And this definitely is way more complex than Lady Susan or Northanger Abbey or Persuasion. It has some plot twists in it, and I think that's why it's higher up on my list, because I just typically enjoy books that have more complex plots and more plot twists in them instead of just very straightforward. You can tell exactly what's going to happen over the course of the entire book after you've read 5 pages. And so I appreciate this one more than the others I've talked about previously. So I definitely enjoyed Sense and Sensibility, and it's interesting since there are dual protagonists in this book instead of it just being one woman as the protagonist. So I enjoyed there being multiple protagonists. So that is Sense and Sensibility. Then the next book on this list, people might be surprised or slightly angry that this is where I place this book on the list, but to each his own, right? Next, we have Pride and Prejudice. Yes, I know it's shocking that Pride and Prejudice is not my favorite or my second favorite Jane Austen book. If this is your favorite Jane Austen book, then I am very happy for you, and I enjoy it too. It's just not my favorite. So, this is definitely Jane Austen's most famous work. Probably a lot of people, this is the only Jane Austen book they've ever read, and it was Jane Austen's second work she published while still being alive. It was published in 1813. It's 315 pages long, and of course, the protagonist is Elizabeth Bennet. This is, as I'm sure you already know, an enemies to lovers kind of romance trope. And the thing that makes this not be my favorite is that I'm just not a huge fan of enemies to lovers. I much prefer it just being friends to lovers. I know so many people love the fact that Elizabeth Bennet is just such a spitfire who is constantly trying to put men in their place and show how amazing women are, and that she's not afraid to talk back to men and love the banter between her and the love interest. I definitely am very supportive of women's rights, but I just find friends to lovers much more endearing love stories just from my personal taste. And I also have a difficult time believing the actual storyline a lot of times. Sometimes I struggle with, could someone's first impression of this man really have been that wrong? Or is the guy just pretending to change to get the girl and then is going to go right back to being horrible, kind of a thing? Sometimes I have a hard time believing that the guy really was that amazing the entire time and that the woman just had a bad first impression. And even if the guy isn't the greatest at the beginning of the book, sometimes I find his supposed miraculous change somewhat not believable. I just get worried about young girls reading romances that kind of promote this idea of this is a horrible man who is going to completely change and become the most spectacular person ever just because they fell in love with me, and they're never going to do anything wrong again because their love for me is just that great, and I have now changed this horrible man into someone amazing. I do find the love interest in this one more convincing than a lot of enemies to lovers, but anyway, that's just my personal unpopular opinion. And if this is your absolute favorite kind of romance, I have no judgment. Enjoy those types of romances all you want. I definitely do believe in, the power of love and the power of people to change and giving people multiple chances for sure. I just have seen too many women be so set on the idea that they're going to get a fixer-upper man and just fix him up and make him into the man they want him to be, and it go very poorly for them, which is not exactly what happens in this story. But anyway, those are my thoughts on Pride and Prejudice. It definitely has really good plot twists. The plot is way more complex, and I definitely enjoy reading Pride and Prejudice. Watching the movie, it's just not my very favorite because of my personal taste. Anyway, Now, my second favorite Jane Austen book is Emma. So, Emma was published in 1815. It is 394 pages long, and our protagonist is Emma Woodhouse. I would say the trope for this is friends to lovers, but kind of friends who end up bickering a lot to lovers. Anyway, I first of all just enjoy this more because it's more along the lines of friends to lovers instead of enemies to lovers, and that's just more to my personal taste. I would also say that this is one of Jane Austen's funniest books. She said when she was writing this book that her goal was to create a character that only she would like, and that every single reader would hate Emma Woodhouse. So, a lot of people really do hate this book and can't even finish reading it, or it's their least favorite because Jane Austen achieved her goal very well of making Emma Woodhouse unlikable. Now, I definitely would not want Emma Woodhouse to be my friend because, as demonstrated in the book, if you're Emma Woodhouse's female friend, you kind of get used, abused, and thrown in the trash. But I did find her to be a very fun character to follow and read about, and I greatly enjoyed the humor in this book. And it does have some twists and turns and is, more complex than the books at the bottom of my list. So just know that if you've read Emma or if you try to read Emma and you absolutely cannot stand Emma Woodhouse, that is Jane Austen achieving her goal. You're not supposed to like her, but you can still have fun reading about unlikable characters, in my opinion. It does have some pretty good sappy romance lines in here, and I just personally enjoyed reading this book a lot. So that is Emma. Now, if you've been paying really close attention, you already know what my favorite book is. My favorite Jane Austen book is Mansfield Park. And I know that that is a super unpopular opinion, and that if you're still watching this video, you may be screaming at me for my horrible book taste, but I will explain why it is just my personal favorite. But first, Mansfield Park was published in 1814. It's 507 pages long. The protagonist's name is Fanny Price, and this is a friends to lovers romance. And this is Jane Austen's longest novel. It is the only novel that is a coming of age story. All of these other books, the books start with the protagonist already being at an age where they can get married, and it's immediately jumping into their quest to find a husband. But this book is a coming of age where Fanny Price at the beginning of the book is, I think, around 8 years old, and Fanny Price's mother chose to marry a very poor man and have a bunch of children. And then Fanny Price's aunt decided to marry a really rich guy and have two kids. So one of them chose to marry for love and be in poverty and have a big family, and the other one chose to marry for money and status and have a smaller family. And so I think that it explores the different possible results of are you going to marry for love or are you going to marry for money? Because many people could never find both, they would always have to pick. So I think that's interesting in this book. And when Fanny is young, she is sent to her aunt and uncle's house to live with them and essentially be raised by them. And she's kind of just treated as a servant in the house, pretty much, constantly waiting on her aunt. A lot of people don't enjoy Fanny Price as a character because, well, she has an unfortunate name. Yes, every time I would read Fanny or talk about her, I do think of Aunt Fanny from the Robots movie, but that was a more common name when this book was written. And also, some people don't like how long this book is. A lot of people enjoy shorter books more. And Fanny is definitely the strong, silent type instead of being bold and loud like Elizabeth Bennet. And so they find Fanny boring and not entertaining. And also, I would say that this is probably the least romantic book out of all of these books. The romance definitely seems a little bit more like a background story and not the most appealing romance. And I totally understand that if your idea of an entertaining romance book is something that's shorter with a Spitfire main character and has just really heavy emphasis on being highly romantic, then yeah, you're probably not going to enjoy this book very much. I just really appreciated that with Fanny Price, even though she was quiet and overlooked by many people, she had a certain set of morals and she dug her heels in. And even when every single person she was around was pressuring her and trying to use peer pressure to make her do certain things, if it was against her morals, she would just stand her ground and tell them no and would not be pressured into doing things she didn't want to do. So even though a lot of people view her as a pushover, I think that she's actually one of the strongest characters that Jane Austen wrote because, like in Persuasion, Anne was very quiet, but she also was very persuadable by other people. But Fanny Price is quiet, and you absolutely cannot convince her, no matter how much peer pressure you apply, to do something that is against her morals. And some people really do find the romance disturbing in this book. I just tried to keep in mind that whenever this was published in 1814, that type of romance was normal. And so I just try to look at it as, yeah, people don't go out and do that today, but for the time period, that was acceptable. Anyway, I'm not going to go into any further detail about that, but if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. And I just really appreciated that this book helped me really get to know the main character, got to let me see her life from when she was a young child all the way until adulthood. We got to see her change and grow after the years. We got to see her come into her own. And one thing that I dislike is when I'm reading a book and I think about, oh, if I had just done what that protagonist had done, or if I was in that situation that protagonist was in, I would be so embarrassed right now, and I would just feel embarrassed for the main character. And I don't remember ever feeling embarrassed for Fanny Price. I think, obviously, she's not perfect, but I think that she just was way more calculating about her behavior and what she would say and what she would do, and was so firm in sticking to what she believed that I wasn't feeling embarrassed for her in this book, and I really appreciate that. And also, in this book, Fanny Price's relationship with her older brother is one of the very most adorable sibling relationships I have ever seen portrayed in a book ever. And anyway, so that is what makes Mansfield Park my favorite, and I completely understand if it is not your favorite. And anyway, so that is my ranking of Jane Austen's works. And I would be really interested to know in the comments if you have read any of these books, what your thoughts were. If you've read all of them, what would be your ranking order? And I just have two more books that I'm going to mention real fast. So, besides rereading these Jane Austen books, I am looking forward to reading Evelina by Frances Burney in the future. This was published in 1778, and I have heard that Jane Austen was very heavily influenced by this book, that it really inspired her writing. I did hear once that Jane Austen directly copied some of the lines out of this book into some of her other novels. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I'm looking forward to eventually reading this book to see where some of Jane Austen's inspiration came from. And I'm also looking forward to reading Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. This is a biography about Jane Austen, and I'm really looking forward to reading it and learning more about Jane Austen, because I can tell from the books that she wrote that she was probably a very fun and cool lady, and I'm looking forward to learning more about her. So, thank you very much for watching this video. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a blessed day. Bye now.